Test, test. Test, test. Yeah, that's good. Morning, everyone. So we're going to get started in about 5 more minutes. So if you want to get something to eat or something to drink, now's the time. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute's forum series. Today we are discussing food governance in New York City, and part of the motivation for this forum is a new report that we put out just a few days ago, which there'll be a new version of the report. Well, there's already a new version of the report updated on our website with a few small changes. But the report really looks at food governance in New York City and what are the sort of mechanisms that are in place in order to make food policy change, and who are the people who are the stakeholders, who are the policymakers, who are the thinkers that lead food policy and food governance in the city. And in service of that cause, we were able to gather an illustrious panel. For the first time, we have all three of the folks who've held the food policy coordinator / food policy director position for the city of New York. And in preparing for this, we had some preliminary discussions where we were able to talk a little bit about what this was going to look like and what sort of things would be discussed. And it was really exciting to talk to each of the panelists individually to get a sense of their experiences and to as we discuss, see some of their excitement about talking to one another and being able to share their experiences with you. But before I go any further, I just wanted to recognize our former colleague Ashley Raffalo, who's here somewhere, right in the back. If you could stand up, please. Ashley just recently left our institute, but she has been integral in putting together these forums over the last few years since we started at Hunter and then began the institute here. And this is our first forum put together partially without her because she helped to set everything up. But I just wanted to recognize you. The team wanted to recognize you and thank you for all of your time and effort in putting these together in the past. So with that said, on with the show. So first up, I'm going to start at the end, well, second to the end. My colleague Jan Poppendick is at the end. We have Ben Thomases, who's the executive director of Queens Community House and the former food policy coordinator for the city of New York from 2007 to 2010. Next to Ben is Kim Kessler, Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Chronic Disease and Tobacco Control at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and former food policy coordinator for the city of New York from 2011 to 2013. And to my right, we have Barbara Turk, who is the current director of food policy for the city of New York from 2014 to now. And on the very end, we have my colleague, Jan Poppendick, who is going to provide a response to some of the things that are discussed here. And I'm Craig Willingham. I'm the Deputy Director for the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. I'd like to make a little note about the difference between government and governance. And really what we try to unpack in our guide and also what we'll attempt to unpack here today is, what's the distinction between the two? And for us, government describes a body that makes and implements binding decisions for which it has legal authority for residents and businesses in a defined geographic area, while governance, on the other hand, really is a broader term that includes the roles that civil society plays, businesses, communities, and residents in shaping the government responses to public problems. So in putting that definition out there, I want to start with my first question. I'm going to start with you, Ben. We'll try to go in chronological order, but feel free to ask one another questions, and I want to keep it loose. And if something comes to mind that seems relevant, feel free to pop in. So the first question is, could you describe a highlight from your time as a food policy coordinator, director, something that you feel proud of, something that you really think is emblematic of your time at the mayor's office?
Is this thing on? This is on, okay. Morning, everybody. That's an unfair question, although I was prepared for it. It's an unfair question. I'm very proud of the work that we did, and when I say we, I mean myself and the team of people inside city government who I worked with at the time during my time as food policy coordinator, and it's unfair to have to pick one highlight. But because there were so many great things, we created the Green Cards program, we created the Fresh program, we launched the food standards that oversaw, that regulate all the meals and snacks served by city agencies every year. But I'm going to pick one highlight that's actually sort of one of the little-known highlights that there was never a press conference about. We never really talked about it that much publicly. But we dramatically reduced the wait times at what were then food stamp offices throughout the city. When I started as food policy coordinator, the standard procedure at HRA was that everybody who applied for food stamps had to make 2 visits to the food stamp offices. They had to make sort of a preliminary visit where there would be an eligibility screening, and they would find out more about the application process and find out what the documentation requirements were, and then a second visit. And the wait times for the first visit were often 2 hours, and the wait times for the second visit were often more than that. And the city at the time had a computer system that was only in place at about a third of the food stamp offices citywide that would track wait times. And when I asked the executive deputy commissioner at HRA who oversaw the food stamp program if he'd ever looked at the wait time statistics, he said no. So we started. When I first asked for those numbers, it took HRA about a month to produce them. I think because it took them about 3 days to produce them, and then about a month to decide that they could share something so embarrassing with City Hall. But once we sat down and looked at them, we brought in a process improvement consultant who worked closely with a team of the food stamp offices. We made the standard procedure that people could apply for food stamps in 1 visit, and the wait times for that visit came down under 2 hours pretty quickly. So I'm very proud. I think that says a lot about it's an incredibly important way to treat low-income people with dignity, with the dignity that they deserve when they're coming in to get this essential benefit.
Very nice, Ben. So I agree with Ben. It's a difficult question. I was thinking about this. I'm like, why do I always hate this question? And I think part of it is, as Ben referenced, the role of the office is so much about catalyzing, galvanizing, and supporting the work of others inside and outside of city government. So as Ben said, we. And there's a part of it that it feels like, well, you're so pleased when things that you're working on actually come to fruition and come into existence. It really represents the work of so very many people. And part of just one kind of example of that, of success for me, during my time, Ben referenced the agency food standards, which are still thriving. And during my time in the office, we would meet with agencies twice a year to talk about where they were with the standards, some challenges, progress made. And to be honest, those meetings weren't always great. Agencies sometimes, were facing either they needed more internal support, they had challenges with vendors, there were, issues that they wanted to raise with you. So you sort of brace yourself to get ready for them. But I distinctly remember one time going to visit a colleague at a city agency and sitting down, ready for the meeting, and he started out by sharing a story of a recent site visit that he'd made. And at the site visit, he sat down and had a meal with some kids at this particular agency. And he immediately shared how they sat and ate together, and he was talking about eating healthy with the kids, and he was getting them to try carrots. And he was so incredibly pleased that the agency was offering this healthier food, and he was excited and proud to be part of it. And to me, that was this incredible moment of success, because the role of the office is really when you see others embracing advancing food policy. He had become a champion of the standards in his agency. He was the one making the work happen, and that is the kind of thing that you want to see, I think, when you're in the role. So to respond, I guess, a little bit more directly, I'm going to try and cheat too, because I think it is a bit like choosing one of your children. There's so many things that happen, and you're happy to see them happen. But one example of something that happened when I was in the office of the Obesity Task Force, which included a whole host of initiatives, and I think it was important because it really did speak to. It involved, I think a dozen city agency commissioners. And it really spoke to that cross-agency effort that's such a part of this work also. It set really ambitious goals, and while we weren't able to bring to fruition everything in there, it did result in new and expanded initiatives in a whole host of areas, from urban agriculture to school nutrition to expanding our incentives program, the Health Flex program. And it also, I think, speaks to, another piece of this is just the fact that the three of us are here and that the work expanded and continued is, I think, a highlight. And it is, in a way, a testament to all of your efforts. Everyone, the people in this room, from the city agency staff to the advocates, the fact that this continues is a shared success, I think, and it really matters. And I'll give one example of that, which is something that we didn't complete in the Obesity Task Force, which was our goal of creating 5 new night shifts. And this was partially inspired by being able to get one off the ground. And again, many hands were involved in that, including our office helping to catalyze some resources towards it and champion that effort. But we weren't able to complete the process for continuing that work. But under Barbara's leadership, that work has continued and actually happened. So that I don't think it would have if we didn't have the food policy director. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kim. And so the question when I read it was, what are you proud of? And I sort of ignored the part about the one thing. So the first thing I'm proud of, and consistent with our theme of, governance. So the first thing that I'm proud of is I'm proud of my staff. And you guys get to stand up too. So Molly Hartman is back there. Morgan Ames is back there. There are now 3 people in this office, which seems insane to those of you who have struggled this route. I like to tell people that under the de Blasio administration, the office has increased by 50%. But I'm proud of my staff because I think they embody. If you've had anything to do with our office, I hope that you've had the experience of my office as being a place where you can come and talk over your ideas, and where we can figure out with you how you can best do your work and how we can best work together. So I'm very connected to that. I'm very proud of our collaborative ethic in the office. We could always do better, and I suspect that you will have ideas for how we could do better going forward. But I think we've tried to create we've tried to contribute to the sense of a community of people that are working for change in the food system, and to be a critical part of that, and to appreciate your leadership in your respective roles. The second thing is, of course, what Kim said, which is I would echo in the sense that I don't think anybody should assume that it's a slam dunk. Well, let me phrase this differently. The achievement is that this role survived a mayoral transition. And nobody should assume that that's a slam dunk. And that comment is not a comment on the mayor's commitments or anything like that. But this office is not part of the city charter. This office, this is a little inside baseball, a little civics lesson that I love to use. It's not in the city charter. It's not written into law. It's an executive order by a mayor. It is an executive order by Mayor Bloomberg. There was actually, I think Pam would kill me if I didn't mention that we have a mutual friend Pam Green, who served as a food policy director of sorts in the Koch administration. So it really is like any other city mayoral office that's not part of the charter, and mayors are free to create any kinds of offices they want. The mayor's office of X. So if I think back to my days in the Dinkins administration and I look at what there were mayor's offices of, it's a very different, set of offices very consistent with that mayor's priorities and the time in which David Dinkins was mayor versus what this mayor has, and certainly what Mayor Bloomberg had, so Mayor Giuliani and so forth. I did not take the time to go through my vast collection of green books, because that's the kind of government nerd I am. I have them all, going back to when I was a Village Voice reporter. So, but there is a lot of, there's just a lot of, to learn about a mayoral priorities, about what kinds of offices they create, right, and how they do that, how they organize their own internal city hall. So it has continued, and I think the other piece of this that I'm very proud of is that in terms of our focus, we really have added a real strength in the area of the economic development side, the retail side, by bringing Molly on board and deepened our base within the mayor's office to be influential on those issues. And the collaboration that I'm most proud of being part of course, it's always the most recent thing. It's your favorite child. They're all my favorite children. We have a saying in our office. It's been a banner day in food policy, and I know you know what I'm talking about, y'all. So, but there was a particularly big one where I felt like I actually said I can die now, which was universal school meals. And congratulations to all of you for making that possible. And I think it's a model for a lot of things we could do going forward. So I'm very proud of that, particularly as it relates to this topic.
All right. Mention of green books. That's a deep album cut for the policy heads out there. Yes. One of the things that really stood out to me about the examples that all of you mentioned is that when I hear them, I think about all of the people that have been impacted by those sort of changes. And those are the sorts of things I think for folks who are interested in the sort of impact that policy can have. They're really thinking about the way it affects people as opposed to sort of technocratic approach. And the examples that you mentioned all, to my mind, really resonate with the way in which it changes how people get food, who gets food in New York City. That's really interesting. So for the next question, I wanted to ask, how did food policy governance in New York City work during your time when you were in the mayor's office? What changed? What changed about the position? And what are the sorts of things that really, are features of, say, 10 years ago, Ben, that perhaps are very different now?
Yeah, I'll pick up with some things that Barbara said. I mean, it's really remarkable, the differences, right? Barbara is the food policy director. I was started as the food policy coordinator. Barbara has 4 staff. I had none. 3 staff. There's 4. And so I think that we should be clear as a community that although the position was launched with much fanfare, actually the Bloomberg administration was reasonably ambivalent in the ways that administrations can be, that administrations that house hundreds or thousands of important opinions about the creation of the position. So there were people at OMB who were very ambivalent about the creation of position. I was actually sort of given preliminary notice that I had been hired, and then sat on ice for 6 weeks while the deputy mayor tried to convince OMB to come up with the money for my salary. And
OMB, for those who
don't know. Office of Management and Budget. Sorry. And the health department was ambivalent about the creation of my position. The health department was concerned that it was an encroachment on their control over the issues that they held very dear to have someone in City Hall, and they resisted it to some extent at the time. So there was a lot of ambivalence, and I think the amount of resources that were committed. I don't know what Barbara's salary is, and I won't ask her to say, but I was paid $85,000 a year when I first started. There was an article in the Times, actually, about 6 months after I started. It was sort of like, well, people are so excited about this food policy coordinator, but he has no staff, and he's pretty low paid. And there were City Hall insiders who were quoted off the record in the article saying, well, if he's paid $85,000 a year, he must not be that influential, which was true, actually. It was true. I was not that influential. I mean, people would come, I would meet people at events, and they'd be, oh, so excited, food advocates, you should do this, you should do that, you should tell the mayor this. in 3.5 years in the job, I never had a substantive conversation with the mayor about food policy. That's not how the Bloomberg administration was structured. That wasn't the level of seniority that I was at. And so food policy governance changed because, and I had a very, very specific mandate. It was another weird thing. No one knew what the food policy coordinator was supposed to do. So there was this like 2-page memo that the speaker and Deputy Mayor Gibbs' office had crafted together. The position was created, I should say, through a lot of advocacy by advocacy groups, which was then adopted by Speaker Chris Quinn, who really pushed the City Hall to make it happen and who got a couple of people inside Deputy Mayor Gibbs' office to care enough that there were some internal advocates within Deputy Mayor Gibbs' office who were pushing for it as well. And they together, those people in City Hall and the Speaker, in consultation with the advocates, crafted this sort of 2-page memo that focused on 3 issues: access to and utilization of food support programs, so everything from food stamps to school meals and other lesser used programs, the sort of the nutritional value of food served by city agencies. So that was where the sort of the food standards came from, that idea that we were going to take a look at that. There was not a mandate to create food standards. That was something that we sort of decided was the most sensible approach after months of conversations about it. And then the issue of food deserts and retail access to healthy food. So those were sort of the 3 things that were included in the food policy coordinator's job description. And it took a lot of time and incredible effort to just overcome, first of all, the internal city agency's resistance to this idea of a food policy coordinator, persuading the health department that as much as they own this issue and the idea that there should be, that the city should have some policies and should focus on serving healthy meals and snacks, that they were much better off working in partnership with a person in City Hall to get something like that done. That took a lot of effort, and it's amazing how that effort continued throughout my time. So I'd say one of the things that changed is that there's sort of a core group of city agencies after 3.5 years who were really bought in. They felt like we got the food standards done in a way that we never would have gotten done if there had not been a food policy coordinator. But then there were other city agencies and remember, city agencies are not monolithic. Every time you work on a different project, you can end up working with a different team at a city agency, which has almost no communication with the other team you've been working on at a city agency. So like I remember my last week on the job, after implementing the food standards, we were starting to look at vending machines and other kinds of vendors, other sorts of food that was sold on city property. And I had a meeting with the Parks Department. Last week on the job, the Health Department and I were meeting with the Parks Department to talk about city parks, particularly in Central Park. And it was the same story. These people were like, we've been thinking about this a lot. We don't need you. Why are you bothering us? And I was like, I am so done. I am really glad that after 3.5 years of kind of trying to overcome this agency resistance, the idea of a food policy coordinator, that I am passing this baton off to someone else. So you know, I am really curious to know. I've never really had a chance to ask him this question, but you know, the extent to which I don't know the extent to which the sort of were easily continued with the core agencies like the Health Department and the Office of School Food, and or the extent to which that had to be restarted, and how sort of the work of widening the core of partners proceeded.
Probably did talk about it, but you may not remember because I would call Ben, because there's only one other person who understands the situation that you're in. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about that. I think so. Then I came along, you know, bright-eyed, ready to go to battle with the city agencies. I think that those trusting relationships definitely persisted with those core agencies. So I think in general, the office and in terms of those relationships and also internal sort of City Hall credibility. And I will say, this was Ben and the other people who helped make these things happen, but there was such a track record of success. I mean, the amount of things that got off the ground under Ben's tenure was incredible, especially with the resources that he had. So so I benefited from that. And it was double-edged in the sense that in terms of the expectations for the office, I think, then that also, there was also a greater sense of, what can we expect from this office, both internally and externally. So the health department, I see colleagues from different agencies, HRA, school food, I think there we were able to, I would say more or less pick up from where we left off. I was briefed right away by the health department on here's, what you can do, and they had a whole agenda ready for the office. But part of the transition at the time that I was there was that, the broader understanding, the advocates' understanding of what food policy encompassed, it was widening. So I think, and that was reflected in my time there. We really expanded the scope of the agencies that we worked with. Plan YC was being updated in my first few months in the office. I think during our time, one of my goals was to sort of take what had happened in Ben's time there and really institutionalize it, try to make it more transparent and public facing, but also internally sort of branded. So we started the website by getting it into Plan YC, by getting food policy objectives into Plan YC, even if not necessarily in the way that everyone would have liked to have seen them. That's part of institutionalization, and it creates a mechanism for tracking with the city agencies in an ongoing way. It created paths for partnership with different types of internal, deputy mayor's offices, but also city agencies. So that by the time that I left, I know under Barbara's tenure, like food waste is at the forefront of one of the things that she'd be able to work on. And we were just getting started with those kinds of conversations when I was leaving. But we were working with NYCHA, with DEP and water promotion, with parks, like pretty much regularly, both on vending, but urban agriculture also. And so I think that the circle widened.
Kim's being very careful that we don't get whatever she has. Thanks for coming. So, I guess I'd say a couple of things about this building. We're going to do a version of what's been happening over 10 years in our roles, because I want to build on some things that both of you said and add a couple of things. So, as you can tell, by the time 2014 rolled around and I showed up, there were tracks in the snow, as we say in Ohio, and we had, there was already the food policy, or the food metrics were well established as something we do. Working on one NYC was something we were, it was established that the food policy office would be involved in. The office had essentially become more institutionalized. My title is an accident. I just want to say that in public, that I actually I would say food policy coordinator is still more descriptive of what I do. It was sort of Lillian Barrios-Paoli who hired me when she was deputy mayor for Health and Human Services, who looked at kind of what she was doing with the rest of her portfolio and felt that I should be a director within the city government. So it was understood in city government that I was a director, which suggests that I can wave. It was a little bit of a burden because it suggested that I could wave a magic wand and make changes and everything.
Not as much of a burden as food czar, though. That's a burden.
Yeah. So what I was about to say is, so when I was introduced to people, it was sort of like, well, Barbara Turk is the new food czar. I have so much so just get the word out. I haven't tweeted about this or anything, but food czar doesn't really work for me either, for both historical reference reasons and because it also is not descriptive. Food policy coordinator still feels like it rings true for me. Also, people started hiding what they were eating in front of me. Barbara Turk is the new food police. This is where we were at when I showed up, and whatever. I mean, this is all true. I'm not making this up. We're in good. Yeah, it's all true. Anyway, so I think here's the thing. There was a new mayor, right? And that's how I got there. I had been working in the Dinkins administration for many years and was not really welcome in the Giuliani administration. They asked me to leave, and the rest is history, but I did some other things. I came back in this administration because I share a lot of values with this administration, obviously. And with a new mayor came a new deputy mayor, exit Linda Gibbs, who always tells me that she had to wear the mayor down to create this position. And there are many mothers. They're mothers. There's a lot of people who take a lot of credit, I think pretty deservedly. Are there fathers? I haven't heard from the fathers yet, so I'd like to hear more about that later. But anyway, so there was a new deputy mayor, and her experience of the office was strictly with the food standards, I would say, when she was the commissioner at the Department of Aging, and people were calling from the senior centers to tell her that the food didn't taste very good because they had taken all the salt out of it. And so she was really not a big fan, just as an agency commissioner of the standards, so that was one thing. I think another thing was that, Mayor Bloomberg, these are just, I'm stating these as facts. You can interpret them how you want that to interpret them. But Mayor Bloomberg, it seemed to me, had this, obesity task force. People asked me a lot about the obesity task force and whether we were going to continue it. And he was very invested in public health, and Mayor de Blasio was often asked about whether he was going to continue that agenda. Mayor de Blasio's policy positions are not explicitly on healthy food, right? You don't hear a lot about obesity necessarily from this mayor. What you do hear about is, and we have a new health commissioner, a new HRA commissioner who's never seen a food stamp waiver he doesn't like. He came out of legal services. Our health commissioner came out of the Black Panther Party, and in her early days, her formative days, and was in and out of the health department as a leader, and created the community health centers or community health aspects of the department. So we just had a different sort of, we brought this what everybody refers to as the equity lens to the, I just say that because that's another thing I'm working on, a different word that's more helpful, but I think equity lens is working for most of us these days. So, but the idea basically of being every New Yorker is not getting what all New Yorkers are not every New Yorker is succeeding in the New York of today. It's kind of a rehash of, if you remember the Clinton years, it's the economy stupid, that there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of economic injustice, there's a lot of racial injustice in the way systems work. And so that systems change has been sort of the underlining of this and of this administration. And I think, Nevin Cohen here at City University did an article maybe a year ago now, Nevin, about, it was called The Hidden Food Policies of New York, the title of which made me smile because I thought that was pretty funny, actually. But I knew what he was talking about, that doing this work in isolation as food policy without thinking about the larger systems in which the food system is embedded, larger economic systems, the larger issues of low-income New Yorkers was going to be a failure. And so I would always start in the very beginning to talk about the fact that the first thing we needed to do was to raise the minimum wage and make sure that everybody had affordable housing, and that a real emphasis on the fact that food insecurity is also a public health issue. So kind of some reframing of these issues. But from a government's perspective, I think that, it came out of the fact that people elected a new mayor. I don't know that a lot of people are food voters. Something else we could talk about, but I don't see a block of people who are food voters. So I think there are people who vote on other things that are related, but I don't think that there is such a block. So I think that I think I'm going to stop there because we could talk about more of this in the discussion, but I think the change in mayoralty has had a real impact on food governance in the way that Craig is defining it. At least I would like to think so.
So this next question isn't really sort of temporally bound, so I'm going to hop around a little bit and start with Kim. So during your time in the position of food policy coordinator, what were some of the ways that different groups, from civil society groups, the city council, the mayor's office, and others participated in food policy decisions in the city?
There are many ways. I think that takes so many different formats. So obviously during my time city council, and this is still true, it's just very, very engaged in food policy issues, but particularly under the leadership of Speaker Quinn, who had a whole host of initiatives and really helped to drive many changes around food policy. So there was, and that's not so different from other ways that city policy is made in terms of the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch. The other ways, I think that the partners throughout the city, the civil society and CBOs, impact food policy in everything from offering their expertise to implementation to instigation sometimes in terms of what's being called for. And Plan YC is an example of that because it did some of the external pressure much of which was I think groundwork was being laid before I came in there, but that helped to broaden the scope of the office because it's been described in the initial, even the executive order really outlines the challenges of food security and diet-related disease, and there really wasn't a recognition of sort of sustainability components or thinking about this in terms of sustainability or economic development or retail, as Barbara was saying. So I think in terms of shaping the agenda, there's certainly a clear role that external civil society plays, whether that's in the form of reports or articles or letters or meetings with city officials. And these are all of the things that happen. And lending of expertise is really significant also. I met with so many people who helped to inform our agenda and provided technical insight and expertise about what city agencies could do or what we should be asking the federal government for. And I think I'll leave it there.
Ben, your thoughts?
So, first of all, as I said already, it's 100% clear that without the efforts of advocates, the position never would have been created. This was something that advocates pushed for very actively, that Speaker Quinn picked up from the advocacy community and adopted. And also, very much when I was looking at that two-page memo and trying to figure out, okay, it's my third day on the job. What am I supposed to do this morning? Literally, right? You have to imagine. No one's telling me how to spend my time, and there's no clear path forward. That the various sort of briefing papers that were out there from some of the key advocates, from Citizens Committee for Children, the Food Bank, what was then New York City Coalition Against Hunger, all of those sort of advocacy groups. I spent my first few weeks reading all of that stuff and sort of making decisions about what I thought was interesting, talking to other people in city government, exploring. So all of that was very important. And on the other hand, there was no mechanism really for continued ongoing feedback from the groups that was designed to engage them in decision-making processes. We had something I think was the New York City Food and Fitness Partnership, which was it was created through a foundation funding. It was kind of badly designed in certain ways by that foundation, and so it was a challenge. It was a challenge also as a resource challenge for me as one person of how to get the work done. And how to continue to engage with the advocates and have people feeling like their voices were being heard. I remember it very vividly with respect to the creation of the Green Card program, where I came from the food advocacy community as the legislation was being introduced. I came under very, very intense and bitter criticism that the advocacy community felt like they had not had enough opportunity to shape the legislation. That was real. The advocacy community did not have much opportunity to shape the legislation on the one hand. On the other hand, it was a miracle that legislation got out of City Hall in any meaningful way. there were many, many forces within City Hall that were trying to stop and within city government that were trying to stop or undermine that legislation. I remember particularly vividly one meeting with Deputy Mayor Gibbs and Commissioner Frieden and John Feinblatt, who was then the Mayor's Criminal Justice Coordinator. And John didn't like the legislation. They had enough trouble regulating vendors as it was. They didn't need more street vendor permits out there. And he and Linda were close, and he was influencing Linda's thinking about it. And I was sitting at this meeting, and certainly in the Bloomberg administration, when you're sitting at the meeting with people at that level, someone at my level, you maybe can speak twice during a meeting like that. If you want to avoid being disinvited to the next such meeting about one of your key issues. And so John was pushing this compromise proposal where the green card vendors would have been tied to certain street corners in the city, where like the criminal justice coordinator's office was going to pick corners where the vendors would be allowed to operate. And Commissioner Frieden was mad about this, but Linda was looking like she was going to go along with it. I don't think she understood the full implications of the proposal. So I used one of my two opportunities to speak to just ask a question. I said, so just so I'm clear, like if we're talking about 125th Street, this is a true story, we're at 125th Street, and I said, so if we're talking about 125th Street, like within your proposal, the hot dog vendors on 125th Street would continue to be able to locate wherever they want, but our new fresh fruit and vegetable vendors would only be able to locate on the corners that you select. Is that correct? And Linda just looked at me and she said, "Good question." And so that's just one example of many, many examples of how difficult it was to get a quality piece of green card legislation out of City Hall, and how, on some level, City Hall was not set up to really include civic society in that conversation. And so, as I was absorbing the criticism about, well, why does the legislation say this, and I just kept thinking to myself, I don't know how to explain this to folks. That each of these points has been negotiated extensively and is part of a compromise, and that was key to being able to move this forward. And that if somebody had the power at that time to create a process that was more inclusive of the voices of civic society, it was not me. That's I'd say some of my reflections on that question.
I was looking at some notes that I made about this question that I now realize are more appropriate to the next question, because they're suggestions. But I guess I would say the following. I mean, maybe this is a segue to the next section. That, and I'll tell it in the form of a story also. So I remember going to a meeting at City Hall with Lilium on my fourth day, and I had been doing what you would expect me to do. I was reading Ben's 30-page transition memo. It was quite detailed. I think it took me a while to find yours because it was a centralized process, but I did read it. But I had also immediately, all the people who'd been really clamoring to get this position filled, and people I had worked with over many years on other campaigns, or they had been my clients at, they'd been groups I'd worked with at CRE, things like that, right? I was reaching out to them, they were reaching out to me, we were setting up meetings and so on and so forth. The meeting at City Hall in the Cow, how many of you know, this is a good test, how many of you, around access, how many of you know what I mean when I say there was a meeting in the Cow? Yeah, come on, Sabrina, you know what a meeting in the Cow is. So like it's the three people who work for government in this room, right? Like 5 people in government. The Cow is a meeting room in City Hall where actually people come from outside of government sometimes, often it's internal meetings, But, you know, it's I think, emblematic that all the people I see here who've been working on these issues for so long don't know what the cow is. Maybe you've had a meeting at City Hall. I don't know.
Also, you have to say, Barbara, that the cow is called the cow because it stands for the Committee of the Whole, a now defunct.
I was getting there. I was actually getting there. So, you know, when I first started in government, I was working for Carol Bellamy. This is the side story. I was working for Carol Bellamy. There was still a Board of Estimate. The lack of a Board of Estimate in this town has really, I think, changed governance for the worse. Another panel we could do sometime. And for, you know, reasons that looked good on paper, but I think have really disturbed communities in New York. Period, paragraph. We had a meeting in the cow, because I really want to get to this point. And the meeting was with the Food Systems Network. How many of you were part of the Food Systems Network, right? How many of you were at that meeting? Some of you were, right? You remember that meeting? You remember that meeting? Kate remembers it. And I guess it was my first sort of seeing who's out there doing all this work from my new position, right? Because I knew some people from other kinds of work you've been doing and other meetings I'd been in where your work intersected. But I didn't know who was going to be there. I found out later that there had been a process to decide who from the Food Systems Network was going to come to the meeting. And this is not a criticism, I'm just saying this was like the reality at that point around governance. I think you're further along now. But it was sort of like who's in and who's really in and who's really not really in the Food Systems Network was kind of the message. And I remember there were all these people in this room, and I was like, they were talking to me about people who are living low-income lives in New York, and you know, a bunch of other, and public health needs and whatever else it was. And I started, you know, I asked a question at some point because I knew some of those folks for a long time, and I knew that they were kind of single, if I may, kind of one-man bands. And I was kind of like, who are you representing? I mean, who are you you're speaking about, but who are you speaking for? Who are you in this conversation? And I wasn't even, I didn't realize at that time how disruptive that question would be, I guess I would say. And now I'm glad that I asked it. But it seemed to me like a natural question to ask because I had been working at CRE with all these movement groups for so long. I was like, so what's your movement? Tell me about it. And I'd be happy to hear somebody else describe that meeting. But that was my experience of that meeting. And I think that is it remains a challenge when we start to think about issues of governance.
Great.
True shared decision making.
All right, Barbara coming with all the deep municipal cuts here. The cow, Green Book. Taking them back.
Can I come to the panel about the Board of Estimate?
Which is something I only found out about. Nevin actually told me about the Board of Estimate. And then Barbara actually filled in some of the details as well. It's pretty, look it up. There's a whole Wikipedia page on it.
So the Board of Estimate met every 2 weeks. It was an executive body of the City of New York. It had the 3 citywide elected officials on it, and it had the 5 borough presidents on it. It was declared by there was a declaration by it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court that this arrangement violated the one-person, one-vote rule, and that we were out of compliance in New York City with that rule. Because each of the citywide elected officials had 2 votes, and each of the borough presidents had 1 vote. The borough presidents all had different size numbers of people in their boroughs, as we do now. As a practical matter, it worked as a consensus body largely, and every single contract, every single franchise, every single, including sidewalk sheds, the green markets the green carts would have come before the Board of Estimate, and it would have been a very interesting conversation. I think it'd be interesting to do a mock day with Ben as a key advisor of what would have happened if the green card program had been considered by the borough presidents, because it would have gone through the city council members, but then the borough presidents and the city council members at that time, the city council president, Carol Bellamy. Did I mention Carol Bellamy? Carol Bellamy and Ed Koch and his representative, and Jay Golden, who was the controller at that time. And then the last year of the Board of Estimate, David Dinkins was borough president. I worked for him, and after I worked for David, after I worked for Carol, and then there was That was the last year of it. But it was all the land use, all this development that's going on. The city would literally look different.
And the report that we released on Tuesday really sort of gets into the nitty-gritty of a lot of these sort of civic details, starting 10 years ago and going up today. Yeah. So lots of mechanisms for governance in the city, both recently and going back some 20, 30 years. And again, the report that we put out on Tuesday, which you can find the executive summary over on the table, and there's actually going to be a part 2 of the report that really is more of an analysis of food policy over the last 10 years, focuses on a lot of the sort of nitty-gritty of how food policy gets done. And to that end, I wanted to ask the last question. Since our report looks at food policy governance in NYC over the last 10 years, in thinking about the next decade, imagine it's 2027, what would a developed and evolved food policy governance system look like? What do you think would stay the same as now, and what do you think might change? And I'll start with you, Ben.
So, so going back to this question of governance and the involvement of civic society and groups, I also want to share, when I was food policy coordinator, I had the opportunity to speak at a conference in Rome. And when I was speaking at the conference, I made sure to meet with the person who had been the director of school food in Rome and had really revolutionized school food in Rome. If any of you ever have a chance to visit a school cafeteria in Rome, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is otherworldly compared to your American school cafeteria experiences. And you should know that when I asked the food policy, the director of the Office of School Food in Rome, how she did this, how did she get all this scratch cooking and organic produce into the kitchens in Rome, that she said it was easy because school food had been one of the main issues in the last mayoral election. What? I literally, you have to picture the look on my face. What? School food was a major issue in the mayoral election in Rome? Like, can you imagine school food as a major issue in a mayoral election in New York City? Can you imagine a mayor coming into office with this clear mandate to improve school food? I mean, it's just, right? I mean, really, really different. I'm talking about, I as food policy coordinator, I was saying this to Barbara, I used to speculate when Joel Klein was schools chancellor. I'm a fan of Joel Klein and a lot of what he accomplished as schools chancellor, but I do not think that he spent more than 5 minutes a year thinking about the Office of School Food, which is a $350 million agency, and that was under his direct supervision. And so, it's just a really different political environment, and political engagement of ordinary people is the key to change. And I have a very different perspective now as the executive director of Queens Community House, which is an organization that actively promotes participation of people in our neighborhoods in civic society. I have a perspective both on how difficult this is and how important it is. And I also should say that, and this one thing that's true from my time in City Hall and from my time now, and I think this is what Barbara was referring to. When I was in City Hall, I would talk to CBO leaders, like the role that I'm in now, and expect them to sort of represent communities. But you should all know and rest assured that I, as executive director of Queens Community House, which is an organization with an $18 million budget and 375 employees, am not spending my days like wandering the neighborhoods of Queens talking to regular folks about their concerns about food or anything else, right? Like, it's a big job with a lot of responsibility, which is primarily kind of operating the programs that we're contracted to operate. And so a lot of people who sort of sit around those tables in communication with city government and being asked to represent communities, and I am asked to represent our neighborhoods, are not actually, we're sort of, I'm in a better position to represent our neighborhood than the folks I interact with from city government, that's for sure. But I'm not actually in such a great position to represent our neighborhoods, and we don't actually have quality structures in place to gather information from neighborhoods and from regular folks, and really kind of bring that up into the decision-making process. So, and I think if that's something that we want, and I believe that it should be, and I believe that that transcends food policy by a lot. We just have to think very differently about our democracy and the structures that are in place in our democracy and what we ask of our elected officials and what we hold them accountable for. So I think a lot of positive change is possible, and a lot of positive change that is much more incorporating the voices of regular folks. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done so that also that those folks are voting and making their voices heard in a whole host of other ways.
I don't have that much to add to Ben's answer. I think that this question of what it looks like in 10 years is really a question for all of us. And Ben's story about the mayor's race in Rome, ended with Ben saying, imagine if that was true here. So I think this really is about what can we imagine together? What do we believe we can make possible? And when we will have food policy governance that that reflects all the types of considerations that are being raised here and all of the needs that we know communities and people are experiencing throughout New York City, is when those needs and issues are infiltrating throughout and permeating all of our regular policy-making processes. So when they're being discussed at community boards, when we have, we do have, many structures, and we have notice and comment periods, and we have city council hearings, and food policy is certainly much more on the agenda, I think, than it was in those discussions. But it really means improving those existing mechanisms, but also taking advantage of all of those existing mechanisms so that there isn't I don't know if there's a separate type of governance structure for this, but rather a forceful, deep conversation in the city that's elevating and advancing these issues. So I think that it really is about that sort of what can we imagine, and it starts with conversations in this room and the conversations that you have and the conversations that are happening all across New York.
So voting is really, that's the one. And I feel like it makes a difference who the mayor is. And then, 1 in 4 registered voters vote is absurd. It's more terrifying to me than, especially in the context of the moment, the time that we're in right now nationally, that only 24% of registered voters could be bothered in New York City, and what that says about us as a city. It concerns me. And why did the people who voted vote? Another good question, if we want to look at it that way. And what was it that said, I care enough about this to vote? I think we can safely say that there are plenty of people who wanted to go out there and make sure they didn't vote, that they voted for de Blasio's opponent. Who were those people? Why did they vote the way they did? Who voted for Bill de Blasio and why? I think we just need to be more, people need to be more engaged in those processes. I think that's the moral of part of today's story, and also Ben's story, but also what some of the, as we start to get more local results across the country and learn about these city council races and these different, who's getting elected, who got elected in offices where I do think the rubber hits the road on governance. I think we didn't get a chance to talk much about our city council, but I can tell you that the city council is carrying its load and then some related to advancing this agenda. So it really does matter who your council members are. and it really matters who your speaker is. I guess I would also say that this is not a question that is limited to food governance. It's governance in New York City. And I would also say that I don't have 10 years to answer this question. Like, I'm in this job now. So what are we going to do together this year, next year? We got 4 years together to live together. I can play some leadership role, but I hope one of the things you take away from this is I really do worry about this sort of basic level of advocacy, which I've seen through my lifetime, whether it's in LGBT rights or HIV advocacy or other things that I've been involved with, and friends of mine are involved with, is that you start by this sort of, there is kind of a developmental cycle here where as an individual you kind of start by saying, well, how come the government isn't doing something about that? You know, and you're right to ask that question. And you're right to sort of articulate, you know, we were right to articulate a lesbian separatism even. I think there's a bit of a food separatism aspect of what we do, which is we're articulating, and this is all good, not a judgment, that we're articulating what is most important to us, what a food movement cares about, what the systems are, what's involved, where the pressure points are. I mean, I think that's been a lot of the last 10 years where we've advanced that stuff. And then at a certain point, some of us have to break off and start doing those things, start embodying those policies. And I think the issue of who's going to embody the policies, who's going to continue to develop and innovate and create, who's going to confront. I look all day, I look for ACT UP. Where is ACT UP when we need it on, if there really are 1.3 million people in New York City who at some point during the year report that they are food insecure, where's the ACT UP on that? Are we wrong about how we've described that problem? If, you know, you tell me what the public health numbers are on diet-related diseases, right? If that many people are dying from diabetes, if that many people are coming into emergency rooms because they're hypoglycemic because they didn't eat, where's, you know, as Tommy Amiano said after Harvey Milk was shot, I'm just a throwback person on this panel, you know, he stood there at the candlelight march and he said, where is your anger? And I think one of the reasons that we were so able to move so many things on HIV is people were really scared and pissed. And the most prominent and most visible affected population was white gay men. But these were white gay men who worked at Goldman Sachs. You know, they were people, you know, find out about your recent advocacy history, folks. And the concern that a lot of us who are concerned about, like maybe this is an opportune time to start forcing some changes in the healthcare system, the systems changers. We're always worried that we would get left behind once the drugs were identified, right? So it's not enough to just feed people. It's not enough to just find the drugs. It's like we do have to get to those systems changes, but we don't have that kind of, we have some good outside pressure. I think everybody knows Liz Ackles is a hell of an organizer, but who's organizing on these issues, really? That's, I guess, what I want to know, and that's the conversation I'd like to be working on, because I rely on a pincer movement in my role. I rely on people outside government raising these issues, putting the pressure on, not being apologetic. If you have to come pick at me, that's fine. I'm used to that too, from being at MHRA during the days of the epidemic. So, you know, or pick at somebody else. But you know, I don't know how much more talking we can do about all this and getting clear about what our story is. I think we have some common narratives that we could start to organize around and get some action on.
And Barbara, you just reminded me, I left something important off the end of my comments, which was, you know, where is the investment in community organizing? So we, Queens Community House, and our peer organizations we are eager to put the resources out there that it takes to work, the painstaking work to identify community leaders, people in our neighborhoods who can really mobilize their neighbors to help them understand the way the political system works and the ways that they can exercise power, to help them identify the issues that they can act on. And we have a tremendous history of doing that work, but we have just struggled for decades to sustain the resources. You know, I have 375 employees and about a third of a paid organizer. And I would love to have 10 paid organizers, but I mean, finding anyone, government or philanthropic funder, to fund that work is just it's not happening right now. It's just not happening. And if you want real participation by folks in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to these kinds of nitty-gritty things that are not typically in people's top 10 lists, that's the work that needs to be done. And so without that investment, I think that, I'll say it in a positive way, I think if we could make that investment, then in 10 years, governance and food policy on a whole host of issues could be radically different. And that's what's required.
I think we could have a really good conversation, but I want to get to Jan. I worry that we have so sort of sucked up the narrative that we have to be funded to community for community organizing to happen. I think community organizing is happening all over the country without much money. So that's what the food industry would like us to believe.
So, Jan, your response to some of what's been discussed here today, and Ben, if you could let Jan use your microphone.
Okay, and I'm going to keep it very brief because I'd like us to have at least a few minutes for questions from the assembly here. And my first response is thank you, in all caps with an exclamation point, because probably, Nick, when you wrote to me and asked if I would participate in this, I should have confessed that governance, could there be anything more boring? I mean, I loved every social science course I ever took except political science. Governance, and now it's lively for me. You have made it lively and made me understand the inside-outside dynamics and what we need to do. I'm really looking forward to the second phase of this report that has the substantive recommendations, but you have convinced me that this is an exciting story, so thank you very much for that. And then I did want to open the questioning with a very specific question. One of the obligations of the office, and I know it's true now, and I don't know if it existed when Ben was in the office because I can't remember when Local Law 50 was passed. But anyway, among your jobs is producing the food metrics report. And every time I look at the food metrics report, I feel like, okay, this was a great idea to have food metrics, but who is paying attention to what we're measuring? Because it's kind of like a random collection of interesting things you might want to know. And so I'd just be curious to know, what would you like to see on a revised list of food metrics?
I'm going to answer it first because Barbara doesn't want to. So the food metrics report, boy, that's like a knife to the heart, Jan, because so much effort goes into that report. But I hear you. So I would say, so obviously it's a result of local law, and the first one included just the required metrics that were in the local law. So that's when it started. I think it was 2012. And then the second report was when we were getting ready to leave the office, and so we included really everything that was kind of happening, probably not everything, but as much as we had some sort of metric or thing we could talk about related to food, to really, the goal was to reflect what city government is working on related to food. And the idea was really for more transparency and forward-looking accountability, because I think it is an important tool for people to see over time, what are the investments, where is progress, what's ending, what's beginning, and it's probably the only way to do that. I think you're right. What it doesn't do is more, how is our food system doing? And honestly, I feel like there are people in this room who could speak to this, and I'm looking at Evan, but there are others. Metrics is a challenging area in food system. So that's a bigger question. There are, I think, ways that we could improve. It certainly went through a lot of internal consideration around this, and external probably also, in terms of, outcomes versus outputs versus dollars versus, and so there are some outcomes that are tracked in there. But the complexity of the food system makes it challenging to track outcomes that tie back to, one or another sort of municipal program, which is not to say that we don't have accountability around the programs that we invest in and evaluation and long-term outcomes that we're working toward. And maybe it could be conveyed more, so that way in the report. But I think that it's broad because the work of the city related to food is very broad and deep and touches on a lot of different areas. At a minimum, I think we can agree it's very beautiful to look at, I hope.
And I can break the fourth wall a little bit here, having been at a city agency and had to commit my little bit to the food metrics report. It is a heavy lift. I mean, it's a Herculean effort, and I was always very impressed when I saw it at the end of the year from talking with Molly and, before that when Kim was there, putting forth our little piece was a scramble. And seeing that this completed document that had it all together was always quite impressive.
Just a couple process notes on the food metrics report, which will be coming out probably next week. This is a good area if people want to see a different, I would dare say, more robust set of metrics, or have a conversation about what we're measuring in terms of the city's responsibilities and how we're measuring it, which is another question. The city council, the metric, it covers a lot. It's kind of become an annual report as well, because we want to update the community about what's going on, what the city's up to. But I think, and that's, Molly has really reshaped it in a really incredibly positive way in that regard as a public document. I think the key, there's two things that I want you all to know, is that if you want to change the metrics, talk to the city council. I have no idea who the new speaker is going to be and what their priorities are going to be. And right now, the guy who cares most about the food accounting things in food is Ben Kalos. I had a very rough exploratory conversation about this one time with a key council member in front of 250 Broadway, but it would really have to be something that was on their agenda to change. The second thing is that there is a global effort now, and if you want to know more about this, Tom Forster's here, he can tell you about it. But this idea of, is there any way to think about collective impact of cities on the food system and a set of shared metrics? And that's happening through the work that was done, that New York City was very involved in, developing the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and I think there's a reasonably good collaboration with the Food Systems Network on that as well from the C40.
What's reported in there is much more extensive than what's required by City Council currently. So.
And the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, look it up. It's a very interesting process and an emerging document for those of you who are interested. Jan, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yes, I want to have an advertisement. Some of you may remember years ago we had Nick Saul, the founder of Food Centers Canada, at one of these events, and I just want you to know that he is speaking Monday evening at a series that's organized by Mark Bittman at the Mailman School, and so go on to their website to get the address. It's the Vardalovs Hall, and I don't know quite where it is, but anyway, that's a terrific opportunity for those of you who have heard Nick. He's a real visionary. So, okay. So that was just a little ad, and I think it's time to turn it over to the audience.
All right, question time. So what we're going to do is take a few questions, 2 or 3 at a time, and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to answer them. Since we're kind of limited on mics, we're going to recycle them out. And just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, Stephen O'Brien from School Food. First of all, I want to say it was really an honor to work with all 3 of you during my tenure at School Food. Your leadership has really been exceptional, all 3 of you, during your tenure. I wonder if you could expand a little bit about how important it is to have, or how alignment with both federal, state, and municipal government was in the leadership on all of those levels, and how that impacted your work when it came to food policy.
Oh, God. I mean, it's a crazy system of government we have in this country. Since you asked the question, Stephen, I'll tell another story. I remember vividly being on the phone when we're trying to get the first online application for school food. And the question we were debating was, we, the city, wanted as much of the information that people entered in one year to be pre-populated in the following year so that people would not have to go redo the whole application process over and over again. It was supposed to be one of the big advantages of the online application. But there were regulatory reasons to be concerned about it. And I'll just say that the phone call that we had about it included myself, someone from school, a couple of people from school food. It included this number of people from the State Department of Health, State Department of Education, the office that oversees school food, a number of people from the USDA in Washington, and a number of people from the USDA Eastern region in Boston. And so all of these different, I mean, the fact that there are just so many levels of government, and even there was disagreement even amongst the USDA, and I walked away from that call just saying to myself, if I can't even get the people from USDA in DC and USDA in Boston to agree about what we're allowed to do, how are we going to even find a path forward? So it's difficult, and there's always a lot of work that needs to be done to navigate those various levels of government.
I agree with that. If you think that the city is sort of bureaucratic and difficult to navigate, I think when you start, looking at the state and federal level, you appreciate actually how much more, to my mind, nimble and close to their constituents local government really is. I do think that there's an incredibly important role in looking to the state. And with the state, I think it's a lot often of sort of collaboration or trying to, problem solve around programs that maybe where funding flowing through the state or where you have shared alignment. With the federal government, we really focused on sort of advocacy and how it related to the city. In my time there, ultimately the Farm Bill did not come to fruition, but it was expected to. So we put a lot of effort on our Farm Bill advocacy, and during the time that I was in the office, there was a real growth in these types of offices across the country. And so we did work in alignment hand in hand with local food policy offices to really articulate what was an urban agenda around food, and visited DC a number of times, often with other cities, to highlight, I think, something that was more than what had historically been understood, which was SNAP, which was important, obviously, and always our first and biggest priority, but more so that we had a vested interest in the rest of our food and agriculture programs as they related to city priorities and stakeholders and residents. So we completed a couple of letters relating to the Farm Bill and did Hill visits relating to that, and also CNR, which a number of people in this room were involved in, and working with city agencies to come up with aligned messaging around what the new nutrition standards should look like and what food standards priorities should be. So I think that coordination, both internally among city government, is an important function of the office, obviously hand in hand with our legislative affairs offices, but also externally with other partners and stakeholders who can amplify the interests of the city.
Well, things have changed a little bit at the federal level, and the relationship, between the principles between the state and the city is well publicized, possibly overwrought. I would say that what I would like all of you to know is that we work very well at agency levels with our state counterparts. I think you're part of that, Stephen, and I want to thank you for your more than 10 years of service, and would love it. One of the other ways that all of us can contribute to advancing the cause here is to understand more about what changes have happened with school food over the last 10 years, because it's not, you're now college seniors school food.
Okay, being mindful of the time, maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So I see one here, and then in the back, and then there's a person with a microphone already.
I was given the mic, so. I have a specific question, and I want to make a comment about community organizing, that you can't, it's not about the money to hire organizers, it's about the mission. What are you organizing for? And that's why school lunch actually got to be universal, because we had a specific mission. But my question, and by the way, thank you all three of you. It's been wonderful working against you and with you sometimes. Rome, how did they get it? And to me, it's a question of money. I mean, who paid for it? Who pays for those school lunches? The organic, made from scratch lunches, and how do we do that here?
And let's do them in bunches. So, Tom, you can get the next one.
Hi, thank you. I'm Tom Forster. I wanted to pick up on the pincer movement comment, which I think was referenced in terms of civil society actors in New York from affected communities that need to be better organized. We heard about quality structures or need to be improved, the ones that exist. But also, we've heard through the Rome mention and the mention of Milan Food Pact that New York is interacting with a lot of cities in parallel motion. And I think the issue of looking at how to measure the status of the urban food system is a common challenge to many cities. And I invite in this next year more attention to be paid. Rome is a UN capital for the 3 global food agencies. New York is the capital for the entire UN system. As we know, next year, the Food City Nexus comes here. It's a very, very important conversation that is going mainstream. And New York City's actors, and it's interesting that it's the youth movements that are being courted by the Rome-based agencies through Parks and Rec and Green Thumb for the last 2 years. And I think there could be a lot more pincer action of the sort that brings both the international and the local neighborhood level activism into coherence. Thank you.
And Dennis in the back.
Hi, Dennis Derrick from Corbin Hill Food Project. Ruth Cambridge, who's the editor of the Nonprofit Quarterly, has been running a whole series of articles. You shake your head, Barbara. So you seem to know like what I'm going to say. And it really raises the whole question of governance. And I think that's a much deeper piece, so that the revolution cannot start until we deal with the issue of governance, which is what you're actually would like to see the revolution started. As a matter of fact, one of the articles is rather provocative, has around the leader of one of the groups is saying, why am I the only one in the room, a person of color? In terms of everything else that's being discussed has to do with, in terms of food, having to do with people of color, Black and Latinos. The issue also is driven by the fact that at the lower level, and you have my attention. Yeah. Should I go ahead? Okay. It's really about the whole issue of governance really begins with what's going on at the grassroots level in terms of nonprofits. And if you see the latest data on nonprofits in terms of governance, the fact is that about 70% of all nonprofits have no person of color on their board. And so the question then becomes, how do we change that to really begin to talk about what voter participation, why the demonstrations, why we aren't demonstrating against your office, and why are we being selected into those meetings in the cow room?
Okay, so first question was about, how do we replicate what happened in Rome? What does this group sort of see as far as development of pincer movements around food? And lastly, Dennis was talking about, how do we diversify, the people who are in the boardrooms, the people who are advocating, and, the people who are a part of this movement. So who wants to begin?
So I just have one response. I'm not going to try to respond to all of that, but I think just to follow on what Dennis raised, that to some extent, for following what Dennis raised, that that a really important conversation and point to articulate is the role of racial injustice and the challenges that we have in our food system, and the how obviously the challenges in our food system impact all people. So we have diet-related disease going across all sorts of populations. But when we look at who is being most impacted, who is being most heavily marketed to, who's living in the environments that have the most challenged food environments, I think we, who's hungry, we have to name and talk about and consider in terms of our tactics to address the legacies of racial injustice and the role that racism has played in that. And that is something that I think under the leadership of Mayor de Blasio and certainly Commissioner Bassett at the Health Department that we are working on. And I think this is maybe not directly, Dennis, what the point that you were raising, but I think it is an important role for all of us and for city government in particular and government in particular. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to acknowledge that.
So I'll just say I don't know what the numbers are now. I don't know if Barbara knows them offhand. When I was in city government, the budget of the Office of School Food was over $300 million, and about $30 million, less than 10% of that was city tax levy money, meaning local tax dollars versus federal subsidies. New York was alone among large jurisdictions at the time in investing any of our local tax dollars in school food. All of the other cities that had, I think it was more than 500,000 people living in them, were using exclusively federal subsidies to pay for their school food. So what it would take to get sort of Rome quality school food here is a much bigger investment of money, a much bigger investment of local tax dollars. And I find it ironic that that you want that, but you don't want to invest money in organizing, because go ahead, schedule a rally at City Hall to say we should be investing $300 million local city tax dollars in school food. See how many people show up without paid organizers. I don't think it's going to be very many. So I think that we have to be honest with ourselves about what sort of, there's a lot of amazing work that can be done by volunteer organizers and pure volunteer groups, but I think if we really want to get the job done and highlight all of these issues, it's going to take more than that. And I think to Dennis's point, and we haven't met, but why are there so few people of color on nonprofit boards? What is the role of nonprofit boards? The primary role of nonprofit boards right now is to keep those nonprofits from going under financially, because the funding sources that we have are not adequate to the obligations that come with those funding sources. So 65% of Queens Community House's $18 million in revenue comes from city contracts. Each one of those city contracts, frankly, comes with more performance obligations, more young people who have to be served in after-school programs, more older adults who have to be served in senior centers, more immigrants who have to be taught English. The price of each one of those obligations exceeds the reimbursement that we get from the city for that work. The same is true at the state level. The same is true at the federal level. We rely on our board to fundraise, to make the difference. And I'm proud. We have an extraordinarily diverse board at Queens Community House. It's relatively easy for us because we have extraordinarily diverse communities. And so we have been able to find people who will represent our communities and who are also able to contribute financially. But we should make no mistake about it. The financial pressures on nonprofits are the single most important reason why nonprofit boards are not diverse. Talk to nonprofit boards and executive directors about what they're looking for in board members. They're looking for people who can support the organization financially with their networks, and think about what the disparities are in terms of income and assets in this country in terms of race and ethnicity. And so, from my perspective, it all goes back to the money.
So thank you very much. I think we'll end it there. This has been an extraordinary conversation, and really a lot of the work that we've done around this report was really, reverse engineering what happened over the last 10 years, and sort of, I guess there's not an analogy to forensic accounting, but it's looking at a lot of government documents and notes from meetings, et cetera. It's really great to hear you all put some of the, context on many of the things we've been looking at on computers for the last year. And I hope also for the audience you were able to get some insight for what it's like for the folks who are on the front line and kind of had a seat at development of food policy over the last 10 years. So thank you everyone for coming. And we have one more thing that I want to mention. Next Wednesday is our grand rounds. I'm going to put the event up there with Marion Nessel, and if you are free and interested, it'll be a really interesting discussion, and I hope that you can make it. And thank you again for coming today. And keep an eye out for part 2 of our governance report coming out in December.